Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Vojdani University. This is episode 3. Once again, I'm Elroy Vojdani, MD. I am the physician founder of Regeneral Wellness, which is my clinic dedicated to treating patients with autoimmune disease. And I'm pleased to have my guest, my dad, Aristo Vojdani, PhD, the chief scientific advisor for Cyrex Laboratories, and really a encyclopedia when it comes to knowledge about autoimmune disease.
Director of Immunosciences.
And director of Immunosciences Laboratory. Let's recap really what we've covered so far. In episode 1, we really went through the background, the history of our understanding of autoimmune disease, how we've kind of come to this point. And in episode 2, we started talking about really specific ways in which the environment can affect your overall health, and in some ways affect the mechanisms of autoimmune disease. And we went all the way back to the prenatal period to the pregnancy period and onward throughout life. And in today's episode 3, we're going to start really talking about autoimmune disease in general and the way we understand it now. And start talking about specific differences between male and females, and start digging into how different portions of the environment may contribute to autoimmune disease.
Yes.
So why don't we start with really an overall concept of autoimmune disease and the so-called 3 stages of autoimmune disease.
Okay. It should be clear that autoimmune disease, like any other disease, it's not like we go to bed, we wake up in the morning, we develop an autoimmune disease.
Mm-hmm.
Cardiovascular disease is the same thing.
Sure.
I think almost every single disease. But in particular, autoimmune disease takes many years.
Mm-hmm.
And the classical example that we read many years ago about in literature is type 1 diabetes.
Okay.
Maybe a child is born with some kind of genetic predisposition for type 1 diabetes, drink milk, the milk is not compatible with he or she, or get some kind of viral infection.
Mm-hmm.
The virus cross-react with the islet cells, and then this whole process of autoimmunity initiates.
Okay.
So then that patient will make antibodies. The antibodies appear in the blood for 5 to 10 years until the patient is not going to feel good and they go to see or seek medical help.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because
That's autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
When the patient is not feeling good, going to the doctor, that's an autoimmune disease.
when symptoms appear.
When symptoms appear.
But the mechanism of the disease is present for several years, sometimes 5 or 10 years.
5
before.
to 10 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, I learned that we can detect anti-islet cell antibodies in the blood of these individuals 5 to 10 years before the full-blown onset of type 1 diabetes, and that could be applied to any autoimmune disease.
I mean, that's tremendous. Okay.
And so therefore, there is a window of opportunity. This is really the heart of the matter. A window of opportunity for intervention.
You're talking about identifying those circulating antibodies before symptoms appear? Is that what you're referring to?
That's right. That's why, in general, we can classify the autoimmune disease to 3 stages.
Okay.
Stage number 1, the triggers are in the body. The patient makes antibodies,
Mm-hmm.
but the antibodies are circulating in the blood.
Okay.
Do not damage any tissue.
Okay.
Stage 2 may take 2, 3, or 5 years. After that, there are more antibodies.
Okay.
In addition to antibodies, there is cellular attack.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, that autoimmunity is not just antibody.
Yeah.
It's cell-mediated immunity or autoimmunity and antibody-mediated autoimmunity.
Right.
So combination of antibodies and cellular attack can damage some of the tissues.
Okay.
At that level, the patient may feel a little bit sluggish, symptoms, no symptoms, still they're not aware that really they have an autoimmune disease because the symptoms are not that strong. They think this is chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia,
Right.
I'm stressed, things like that. But another 3 to 5 years will take until those lymphocytes and antibodies attacking the tissue to such a level cause serious damage. And now the symptoms appear and they go to a doctor, they come to Dr. Elroy Vojdani.
Yeah.
He does anti-nuclear antibodies, which is a general biomarker of
Right.
autoimmunity, anti-DNA antibodies, rheumatoid factor, immune complexes, and then yes, you diagnose, yes, you may have lupus, you may have rheumatoid arthritis, and you may have type 1 diabetes. This is too late. That's why we have to pay attention to all 3 stages of autoimmune disease.
Yes.
Stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3.
Absolutely. And you're saying the goal, and you know, this is the way I practice as well, really the goal here is to catch people in stage 1 of autoimmune disease. And I can't tell you how often, you know, for example, patients will come in with, let's say, type 1 diabetes, and they're in stage 3 of type 1 diabetes. And in the process of working them up, screening, doing a physical examination, I'll find that they also have anti-TPO antibodies.
That's right.
And, you know, they're at the point where their thyroid function is still preserved, okay, but the antibodies are present. So in that case, I'm finding those patients in stage 1 of that disease.
That's right. But one issue which is very important, that we always believe that there is one autoimmune disease, a single disease.
Yes.
And what you just touched in here is that an individual with type 1 diabetes, few years later, could develop also thyroid autoimmunity. So one autoimmune disease always is accompanied by other autoimmune diseases if we don't pay attention to the triggers.
Right. So if you don't remove what the setup was for the initial autoimmune disease in the first place, so in this example, we're talking about type 1 diabetes, if those initial triggers aren't removed, then the body continues to progress along the autoimmune cascade and several other organs can be affected.
The main reason I interjected earlier the issue of milk, for example.
Yeah.
It has been established in the literature, including journals such as New England Journal of Medicine, that some children on formula, if they make antibodies against the casein, beta casein has antigenic similarity or identity similarity with islet cell antigens.
Okay.
So if they react against, they cannot digest properly the casein or other milk proteins, and they make antibody against that, now that becomes a friendly fire, and the antibodies plus lymphocytes attacking the milk, now going to attack their own islet cells.
Sure.
And therefore, if we will identify the triggers, in this case, which is easy, and we find that indeed it is milk, it's very easy. Just remove that milk from the diet of that individual, and hopefully we'll be able to reverse the course of autoimmune disease.
And when we talk about it being relatively easy, it is relatively easy. We draw a sample of blood here in the office and send it off to Cyrex Laboratories and run a test that you developed.
Yes.
And, there are several different arrays, one for gluten, one for foods that are commonly cross-reactive with gluten, one that includes 180 foods in both their raw and cooked forms. There really is a plethora of very easy to perform, very rapidly accessible testing that can identify these triggers for autoimmune disease. And in this case, let's say the patient, array 4, which has dairy products, it has many non-gluten grains on there. So let's say casein comes back positive. We see that the immune system in that case is forming a reaction to a dietary protein that it has deemed dangerous to the body for whatever reason. And the unintended consequence of that is that because the antibodies are so similar to islet cells, that the antibodies that it's forming to the casein are cross-reacting, and progression of type 1 diabetes, or even type 1 diabetes in the first place, is happening. So in many cases, these are the unintended consequences of the body forming a reaction to something in our environment.
In the army, they call it friendly fire. It's like, your own gun attacking your own body.
Yeah.
That's really simple explanation of molecular mimicry or antigenic similarity between milk and human tissue, in this case, islet cells.
Can we talk a little bit about why that happens? It seems like it happens often because we deal with patients with autoimmune disease so much, but let's talk about the intricacy of the immune system and how something like forming antibodies to casein can cross-react with islet cells, for example. Let's talk about that mechanism of molecular mimicry.
Yeah. First of all, there is no doubt that autoimmune diseases are on the rise.
Sure.
Okay. In fact, yesterday I was reading this article about the issue of glyphosates.
Yes.
And as you know, there is a lot of controversies.
Yeah. But for those who don't know, glyphosate is a very commonly used pesticide in the United States. It has the brand name Roundup.
Roundup. And so when I read several articles published by MIT scientists, biochemists, biophysicists, and it looks like to me that they blame everything on glyphosates.
Yeah.
So what they show actually in 1975 all the way to 1990, we didn't have that many disorders, including autism, ADD, ADHD, allergy, Alzheimer's, and name it, and autoimmunities. And then suddenly, when the curve goes like this, and in 2015, 2016, 2017, it's going up and up and up. So although that article is written only about glyphosates, I can put that together, change the name glyphosate to toxic environmental chemicals.
Sure. Okay, Roundup's not the only one.
Roundup is not the only one.
No.
There are many others.
Definitely.
Let's be honest about it.
Of course.
And so therefore, yes, in my opinion, chemicals playing a significant role in our immune system to make a mistake. So let's take example of, again, milk.
Okay.
Why our body should react against milk? In the first place, if we consume any milk products, we should have an excellent digestive enzymes, which they will take the proteins of milk, digest them to peptides, and then enzymes called peptidases, like scissors, will cut down the peptides to amino acids. The amino acids get absorbed, and that's energy for our cells and our body.
Right.
That's a normal condition.
So casein is this big, complex protein, and we have enzymes in our system that break it down into smaller, into the bare essentials, which allows our GI system to absorb it and use the energy in that big protein.
Exactly. So this is normal. That's why, by the way, as we get older, our digestive enzymes, like any other part of the body, may not work properly.
Sure.
We need to take some digestive enzymes.
Sure.
If your doctor will give you digestive enzymes, it's going to help you to digest these proteins to amino acids to get absorbed, and you get your energy.
Yes.
But unfortunately, just think about it. If that casein molecule forms some kind of alliance with toxic chemicals, and glyphosate is one example.
Okay.
Right? So the scissors, which is supposed to cut, the enzyme, which is supposed to cut that protein to peptides and then to amino acids, is not going to work.
So it blocks the body's natural ability to break down this protein.
And so what will happen? Lots of undigested proteins or peptides in the GI tract, which causing inflammation and bloating in the gut.
Okay.
release of all kind of mediators from our microbiomes, cytokines, will open the gut barriers.
Okay.
Undigested peptides from food, now, we are extending that to any food,
Right.
can get to the submucosa, regional lymph nodes, and in circulation. And obviously, if a foreign material from food plus toxic chemicals
Yes.
is in the blood, you think what our immune system is going to do?
Sure. It sees it as an
It's
enemy.
the job, sees that as
Right.
the enemy, goes after it, react to it, and will make antibody against that. And now, unfortunately, due to similarity between that protein, whether it's from gluten or casein or other proteins of lectins, agglutinins, those antibodies react with any component of our body which from molecular structure similar to our tissue.
Yeah.
So they are going to attack self-tissue. Think that is, for example, casein or gluten or lectins or agglutinins.
Right. And the reason that happens is you kind of have to take a step back and understand the way antibodies work. So you have this complex folded protein structure, and the antibodies are really recognizing one portion of it, right? One amino acid sequence of it, or one portion of this folded protein. And because of the way antibodies work in really recognizing small portions of these proteins, and because of how complex proteins are when they're folded, it is not uncommon for different protein structures, in this case we're talking about islet cells and casein, to have portions of that folded protein that are similar to each other.
Yeah.
So it's not that islet cell, the entire islet cell is exactly like casein. All it takes is a small portion of that folded complete protein. If you form antibodies to that portion, they will cross-react, and the body won't tell the difference between casein and islet cells.
That's right. The second way or second mechanisms, chemicals get separated from the food.
Okay.
And get into our blood.
Okay.
And so chemicals, toxic chemicals, or their metabolites, after going into the liver, get metabolized,
Sure.
changed to some degree, can form a new alliance with our tissue.
Okay.
Directly can bind to the tissue.
Okay.
Before that was the antibodies attacking the casein plus the chemicals because of the similarity with our tissue,
Right.
attacking the tissue. In this case, chemicals directly go to the thyroid
Okay. Bind directly to thyroid tissue.
Okay. So what will happen? Our immune system is going to attack the chemicals to get rid of the chemicals. In the process, also is attacking TPO,
Right.
or thyroglobulin or thyroid peroxidase, the joints if in case of arthritis,
Right.
Kidney, or any other part of the body.
And there's a term for this new attack.
Neoantigen formation.
Neoantigen formation.
Neoantigen formation. In both cases is neoantigen formation.
Right.
One with food.
Right.
This one is directly with our tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Neoantigen formation with our tissue. And so this is actually, these two are explaining why autoimmune diseases are on the rise. Because of extensive and overuse of toxic chemicals and our daily exposure to thousands and thousands of chemicals through our food, air, and other lifestyles.
Well, and to go back to our previous point about the stages, we're really talking about how stage 1 of autoimmune disease develops, right? This is really the part of autoimmune disease that we're discussing right now.
Exactly.
And we're giving a few specific examples, but let's talk about, there are really 3 broad categories of different things in our environment that can be the setups for initiation of autoimmune disease, the development of these antibodies, neoantigen formation. So we talked about right now we talked about glyphosate, so that's kind of in the broad category of environmental chemicals,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
What are some other examples of those?
But let's go back to a general scheme.
Sure.
That gene
Okay.
plus 3 environmental triggers
Right.
together playing a role in induction of autoimmunity.
Okay.
So, toxic chemicals,
Okay.
we name them, food,
Okay. 2.
and the third is infectious agents or pathogens.
Infectious
So these are
agents.
3.
The 3.
We'll talk about these, each one of them separately.
Okay.
And so each one of these, through different mechanisms or even through similar mechanisms, can induce autoimmunity.
Okay.
And so we talked about toxic chemicals. We gave glyphosate as an example. My favorite one, and I'm glad you are giving me water with in a glass bottle, right? My favorite one is bisphenol A or plastic.
Sure.
Okay. So why I'm bringing that as an example? Because the extensive use of plastic in the world is unbelievable.
It's everywhere.
These chemicals also are endocrine disruptors.
Yes.
Later on, we'll talk about male and female differences in autoimmune diseases. Endocrine disruptors, what does that mean? Meaning the chemical structure is almost similar or identical to male or female hormones.
Absolutely.
So we know there is also a significant connection between endocrine and the immune system.
Yes.
So if on daily basis, so many endocrine disruptors such as bisphenol A and many others, phthalates and many more,
Parabens.
parabens and others from cosmetics and so forth,
Yeah.
get into our body, and our lymphocytes have receptors.
Yeah.
Okay. For some of these, instead of the hormones will bind to those receptors, now plastic hormones, let's call them plastic hormones,
Yes.
binds to the receptors, and now lymphocytes, which are the main cells producing antibodies.
Yep.
So in this case, what will happen to those lymphocytes? They are going to act to make either more antibodies or less antibodies, or we call that immune dysregulation.
Right.
The immune system loses its regulatory mechanisms and do all kind of mistakes that can then result in autoimmunity.
Absolutely. So to take a step back, we're saying that your hormone system and your immune system talk with each other. Okay. They have a loop of discussion, basically. And hormones can influence the immune system to act one way or the other. And these chemicals that we're talking about, and the chemical we brought up was bisphenol A, which was
Main ingredient of plastic.
ubiquitously present in plastic for decades, is a very, very strong, it has very strong similar properties to estrogen. And in fact, it was developed as an alternative to estradiol therapy in the early 1900s. It was developed as a hormone, and it was then put into plastic. So there are these immune cells that have these receptors waiting for estrogen to come around, and instead this massive amount of bisphenol A comes around, and the immune system is getting the signal that it would think that it needs to either ramp up production of its inflammatory response or turn it down because it's getting all these hormone signals, but the body never intended for that signal to happen. That's what we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. This second issue is that if you look at chemical structure of bisphenol A,
Yes.
and thyroid stimulating hormone receptors, and do me a favor, those who are listening, please go online and ask for chemical structure of bisphenol A, and then ask for also chemical structure of thyroid stimulating hormone.
Okay.
And put these side by side.
Okay.
Almost looks identical.
Okay.
And so what will happen, now you have a component of plastic, bisphenol A, competing with your thyroid hormone.
Right.
Isn't that one of the reasons we have so many thyroid disorders.
It really is unbelievable, the number of people out there. The prevalence of autoimmune thyroid disease is really very alarming. And this is one of the reasons for it.
And so these are just a couple examples. Heavy metals.
Yes.
Pesticides, herbicides. There are many. Formaldehydes,
Benzene.
isocyanate, paint material, benzene compounds, benzene containing compounds, and there are close to 100,000 chemicals
and for,
in our society.
For those of us that live in big urban environments, which is the majority of people, unless you're lucky enough to live in rural Washington, and if you do, I commend you, but those of us who live in urban environments are exposed to thousands of these on a daily basis, and it's almost unavoidable.
Absolutely. Yeah. There is one more issue that sometimes manufacturers are using, saying that these chemicals are safer than aspirin for human beings.
Okay.
And the argument they make, they say, human beings do not have that cycle, that enzyme to metabolize these chemicals. And therefore chemicals will be in and within hours will be out.
Right. Like their urinary excretion is immediate.
Yeah. And so, for example, glyphosate, as you know, 97% of the population, if you'll take their urine right now, they have glyphosate in it. And the same thing with bisphenol A and name it. But they forget that we have the second brain.
Right.
100 trillion, right, bacteria living within.
Yeah. We're referring to the nervous system in the gut, the enteric nervous system.
And our microbiome.
Right.
Okay. So the microbiome, the 100 trillion bacteria, they are very sensitive to these toxic chemicals.
Sure.
So what will happen, that they will destroy the good bacteria and make the bad bacteria to overgrow. The bad bacteria are now releasing all kinds of toxins, opening the gut barriers, which is, I call that immune gate, the gateway to autoimmunity, opening the gate.
Right.
And now all the toxins of bacteria are inside. So in this case, chemicals, the only thing did, change the microbiome.
Right.
Didn't cause autoimmunity.
Right.
But now the bacterial toxins are going to damage our tissue and causing autoimmunity.
Right.
And that's why, as a physician, you pay so much attention to the gut of your patients with autoimmunities.
Yeah. On almost everybody, who has, unfortunately, catching patients in stage 1 autoimmune disease is continuing to be a challenge, right? As we continue to educate, hopefully more people will come in for screening and we'll detect people in those stages, those people who have the genetic predisposition or the environmental setup for it. But, more often we're seeing patients in stage 2 or stage 3 of autoimmune disease, right?
Yes, yes.
Almost everybody will get a Cyrex array 2, which is the array you develop to look at intestinal permeability to see if we have antibodies to the tight junctions and also to see if we have antibodies to the bacterial endotoxin you talked about, lipopolysaccharide, LPS.
That's a gut dysbiosis.
Right. So this is a marker of where are we? Where are we in the state of that barrier, which is the most important barrier to autoimmune disease? Like you said, it's the door.
Yes.
How open is that door open? Number one. And how open is that door?
Exactly.
And oftentimes from colleagues, I'll hear the argument that they don't do this testing because they assume that everyone has an open door. Everyone has leaky gut. And I think that, in all due fairness, that there is really something to be said for having knowledge about, one, whether antibodies are present, because it really tells you something significant is going on with the intestinal barrier. And number two, which I think is a very important point, is, okay, let's say the door is open, leaky gut is present, you have antibodies to tight junction proteins. Are there antibodies to LPS as well? Did bacterial endotoxin manage to penetrate the barrier? Because That's a very, very different situation, I think, than just having the antibodies to the tight junctions.
And also it's very different from having permeability to small molecules
Yes.
like sugar.
Right.
Yes, everybody is having permeability to sugar.
Right.
But we are talking about the door is so much open that large molecules, which their size is 60,000, 100,000, 200,000 Dalton, can go through.
Right. So
And that's different.
It's giving you information that the door is open, and also there is a very significant setup for autoimmune disease that has come in the door as well, and reaction has started to form against it. So I think it's an extremely important test. Thank you for developing it. I order it on almost everybody, and it really is a tremendous value, I think, to those patients to have an idea of what the status is.
So what we learn from this few minutes conversation is first you identify the triggers.
Yes.
Then you remove the triggers. But in the case of chemicals, that's one of the major reasons that your doctor, if understand the issue of the triggers, they do detoxification. They try to remove the toxic chemicals from your body.
Sure.
Because that's the mechanism of induction of autoimmunity.
Right. Because maybe the companies who produce the chemicals are saying they're excreted in the urine immediately. We know that that's not true, that they can bind in different tissues in the body, fat cells, hepatic cells, and their pathogenicity can continue ongoing unless detoxification is kind of supported and the body can help excrete those.
Yeah, let's clarify this a little bit more because it's very important. That many, many years ago, I read this article by a scientist who wrote the following sentence: you and I may be exposed to the same levels of toxic chemicals. One will be completely safe after 5 years.
Okay.
The other one will develop autoimmune disease.
Okay. Why?
Okay? Because we have different enzymes, like our fingerprints. Our enzymes are different.
Yes.
There are low metabolizers, there are medium metabolizers, and fast metabolizers.
Absolutely.
Okay, so each one of us.
You're talking about genetic variations. In different human beings.
Handling chemicals.
Let me give a very basic, easy one for everyone to understand. Okay, we all know that there are people out there that can tolerate very large quantities of caffeine, and people who have 1 cup of coffee and they're jittery for 24 hours from it. Right. That difference is because of genetic variation in the enzyme in the liver, which degrades caffeine, right? So that's what we're talking about.
The same thing could be applied
to chemicals.
In one case, maybe the manufacturers are right. 90% of the chemicals are get out of the body into the urine. In some, 50%. In some, 70%.
Right.
But it is enough, just 10%, even 2% of those chemicals to form new alliance and form new antigen with our tissue and setting the stage for autoimmunity.
Right.
So yes, maybe 90% of chemicals are in and out, but our concern is about those 10% which bind to our tissue and setting the stage for autoimmunity. Is
there a way to, can we talk about ways to test for if we're talking about chemicals in this particular situation, if the body has formed an immune reaction to chemicals?
This is one of my, as you know, one of my favorite subjects.
Yes, it is.
Because I wrote several articles with Dr. Karazian and published them in classical journals, Journal of Applied Toxicology. Okay, in these articles, I made the argument that we are not interested in measuring levels of chemicals in the urine.
Yeah.
You are wasting your money if you are going to measure chemicals in the urine, because you are going to find them.
Sure. Because everyone's exposed to them.
99%.
Right.
Because everybody is exposed to them.
Right.
Our interest is about that 10% of the chemicals which bind to human tissue, whether it's thyroid or joints or even the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So in that article, I made this argument we have two choices.
Okay.
And think a patient is sitting here, and tell that patient you have two choices. We can biopsy your brain, or
Okay.
biopsy your kidney,
Okay.
or biopsy
Your liver.
your liver. And then we'll measure levels of chemicals in your liver or joints or your brain.
Okay.
And so obviously, you cannot do biopsy of the brain,
Right.
right? Or other part. It's not easy. No one will be ready to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one option which is not possible,
Okay.
practically. The second option is to measure antibodies against chemicals bound to human tissue,
Okay.
such as albumin in the blood
Okay.
and hemoglobin.
Okay.
These are the two, or immunoglobulins. These are the 2 or 3 major proteins in the blood. And so if you make antibodies against chemicals bound to albumin or hemoglobin, that's indication of that most probably you are going to make antibodies against other tissues which chemicals are bound to.
Okay.
So that's the only choice we have.
Okay.
And based on that, I developed Array 11, which we measure antibodies against 12 different chemicals, and another 4 or 5 are on their way, where we are measuring antibodies against heavy metals bound to human tissue proteins.
Yes.
Formaldehyde bound to human tissue proteins, isocyanate, and benzene, and others. Bisphenol A, tetrachlorobisphenol A, and many others.
So, in your opinion, there are a lot of people out there who are doing urinary heavy metal testing, maybe taking a sample of hair and testing for levels of mercury in the hair, heavy metals in the hair. That because of the ubiquitous nature of heavy metals and environmental toxins in our everyday world, everyone's going to come back positive for this stuff.
Yes.
And the real meaningful information is, did the environmental chemicals that we're talking about
Became body burden, we call that.
become a body burden? The body has decided to form antibodies against them, and then this is more, I think we're taking the information to another level. Not, are you exposed to heavy metals? Are you exposed to glyphosate? It's, have you been exposed to it, and did your body decide to start forming a inflammatory autoimmune response to them?
Yes.
This is another level, I think, of information that is really important to understand, and I think much more useful in everyday practice. If you go out there into the world, and talk to people who are kind of specializing in environmental exposure, you'll see really a very wide range of how people handle trying to diagnose whether environmental toxins are playing a part in autoimmune disease. And like I said, some people will do a urinary test, some people will do a DMSO challenge, provocation, which is meant to bring some of the heavy metals out of the body and into excretion.
Not only these methods are not really, they are not, you are not going to gain so much information from them. Now they came out with dry urine spot or something like that,
Yeah.
as if the whole issue was not controversial enough. Now they come out with all kind of methodologies,
Yeah.
which are not reproducible in the same laboratory if you send 2 different samples from the same patient.
Yeah. So I think the point is that the waters in the world of discussing how environmental toxins are affecting autoimmunity are muddy, to say the least. But you've done a lot of work and research in it, and we very much strongly believe in the idea that testing for antibodies to tissue complexes with environmental toxins really gives you reliable, reproducible information that really can be tracked also.
Yeah, the meaning of that, yes, you have been exposed to chemicals, yes. Yes, some chemicals bound to your tissue,
Yeah.
and created new antigenic material.
Yeah.
And now your immune system is going to clear the chemicals by attacking your tissue, causing autoimmunity.
Yeah.
Really, the bottom line is we have to pay attention to body burden of toxic chemicals and not measuring levels of chemicals in the urine or blood. In my opinion, they are useless. It's a waste of money, and the best way is to measure body burden of chemicals, to measure antibodies against chemicals bound to human tissue proteins.
Okay. So, we're discussing environmental toxins here, and we've hinted a little bit in the past about the differences between male and female sex and their prevalence of autoimmune disease, knowing that the prevalence is far higher in women. We talked about the article that we're going to write in the future saying the immune system from men is from Mars and the immune system for women is from Venus. Let's talk about why that prevalence is so different.
All right. So this issue is taking me back to 1969.
Okay.
When I finished my bachelor degree and wanted to start my master degree, the summer of 1969, I got a job. My responsibility was with the same professor, which I was going to do my master degree, was to prepare reagent for immunology course of 1970.
Okay.
That's 48 years ago.
Okay.
Okay. So, giving me an antigen plus adjuvant, inject them to rabbits, goats, and sheep.
Okay.
And 2 of each. And every month I was taking blood and injecting again. You have to give a booster shot.
Sure.
After 3 months, when we collected all the blood and were looking at the titer of the antibodies, half of these animals, rabbits, goats, and sheep, gave very high titer of antibodies, and the other half much lower.
Okay.
And I was very puzzled. I went to the professor. I said, why 1 sheep, 1 goat, and 1 rabbit gave us much, much higher levels of antibodies, the other one much lower? For example, one of them 100 units, the other one 200 units.
Okay.
And that's meaning, if you talk about money, the value is double.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
When twice more antibodies.
Right.
He said, let's go back to the animal farm where we did the injections. And he was trained not only in field of immunology, he was a vet doctor.
Okay. An animal doctor.
Animal doctor.
Right.
And immediately he started looking at their sexual organs.
Okay.
And he said, well, which one gave you the highest titer of antibodies? I said, this sheep. He said, it's female. Which goat gave you the highest level of antibodies? He said, this one is female. And the rabbits, so all the females
Unbelievable.
gave high levels of antibodies. Why I'm telling you this? Because it looks like at that time, first of all, we didn't ask why. Just, we learned for the next year only use the female,
okay,
not the male. While, that by itself could open completely a new avenue of research.
Right.
The male and female differences in immune reaction.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, I finished my master, PhD, all of that. But today, when I read the literature, the literature is full of information about male and female differences in the immune response and, unfortunately, autoimmunity.
Okay.
So I made a few notes in here.
Okay.
Number 1, estrogen.
Yes.
Enhancing immune response and autoimmunity.
Okay.
Let's, just estrogen has the capacity to enhance the immune system.
Okay.
That's why we got higher titer of antibodies.
Okay, because females have much higher levels of circulating estrogen, and you're saying it's boosting immune activity.
Yeah, we talked hormones, endocrine, and immune system talking to each other, right? More antibodies. Androgens in men are immunosuppressive.
Okay.
And in fact, some clinicians, they give DHEA.
Yes.
To patients with autoimmune disease.
Yes.
They would like to suppress.
Yeah.
And so that's the mechanism.
Okay.
That's number 1. Female hormones exert broad effects on multiple gene expression.
Okay.
And these gene expressions encoding immunologically relevant molecules. For example, inflammatory cytokines.
Okay.
Another meaning that genetically, the hormones can affect genes responsible for making TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, NF-kappa B.
Mm-hmm.
So, pro-inflammatory cytokines
Sure.
initiate autoimmunity.
Of course.
The next gene is also influenced by hormones, female hormones, toll-like receptors. What are toll-like receptors? That like antenna-like material are on the monocytes. When a foreign material is coming in, these antenna discovering those and going after them.
Yes.
And so it seems they have more activated toll-like receptors. And so therefore more immune response.
Okay.
And more immune response, the probability of mistake is going to be higher.
Sure.
Next, female hormones downregulate a gene in the thymus gland
Okay.
called AIRE, or autoimmune regulator.
Okay.
So I have to give a little bit explanation here. What is AIRE? During evolution and development of the immune system, lymphocytes migrate from bone marrow to the thymus gland
Yes.
in order to become mature.
Mm-hmm. It's their
These-
school.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
their school. So any lymphocytes who carry receptors for self-tissue, that gene is giving the order to be eliminated.
Yes.
Any lymphocytes who carry receptors for bacteria, viruses, and parasites, they should survive, migrate to blood and different part of the body, and these are the soldiers of the immune system which are going to protect us in the future against infections and other foreign material.
Yep.
So far,
They're put out into the circulation to do their work.
That's right.
Right.
Now, if female hormones downregulate this gene, what will be the consequences? That some lymphocytes who carry a receptor for self, before being eliminated, they manage to get into the blood. And what did we call that together? Leaky immune system.
Yes.
So female, because of their hormones, they are more prone to having leaky immune system than the male.
So the thymus, in because of female hormones, is not as efficient in removing self-reactive lymphocytes.
That's right. That's right. So this gene, AIRE,
Yeah.
one, regulates antigen presentation, production of cytokines,
Okay.
also modulates regulatory T cells.
Okay.
So if inhibits Treg cells, what is the job of the Treg cells? To suppress immune system.
Right.
But if they will not do the job, will result in autoimmunity.
Right.
Because there are several levels of protection against autoimmunity.
Right.
One of them is process of elimination. The other one is Treg cell.
Mm-hmm.
We call that peripheral tolerance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was central tolerance in the
In
thymus
thymus.
we talked about.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have 3 levels of tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
Tolerance in the gut,
Uh-huh.
when our body learns how to live in harmony with food that we eat and from the bacteria.
Yep.
Central tolerance,
In the thymus.
that cells get eliminated, and then Treg cells in peripheral tolerance, suppressing the immune system in order not to make antibodies against self-tissues,
Right.
and so forth.
Right.
Unfortunately, sex hormones can affect all these 3.
Okay.
And so therefore, that's why females are more prone to autoimmunity, but do not forget, they will get less cold, flu, and other infectious agents.
Okay.
And men are getting more
So
of those.
we get sick more often, but less afflicted by autoimmune disease,
That's right.
and vice versa for females.
Yeah. So
there is some benefit to it, right?
Yeah. Toxic chemicals.
Females are more sensitive to toxic chemicals.
Yes. And unfortunately, who is using more toxic chemicals, or who is more in contact with toxic chemicals?
Women. I mean, unfortunately, because of the large presence of toxic chemicals in makeup, cosmetics, shampoos, hair dyes, nail polish, they come into direct skin contact with way more environmental toxins than men do on a regular basis.
So those chemicals, they get into the body.
Yeah.
Some of them form neoantigen with their tissue.
Yeah.
Some of them compete with thyroid hormone receptor.
Yeah,
we
and you can imagine exposure on an every day, years and years and years, along with the setup of having a more active immune system because of their hormone differences, can lead to autoimmunity.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there are certain autoimmune diseases. The ratio is 18-1. Some is 9-1.
Huge difference.
Female versus male.
Huge difference.
And so overall I believe, is 3-1.
Yeah.
3 times more autoimmune disease in female than in male because of some of these mechanisms. Some of them we can blame it on the hormones, but the rest on the environmental
exposure.
triggers.
Yes. So let's take the example of a woman who has an autoimmune disease. Let's take MS. That's another one where women are more exposed to environment, or there's a higher prevalence of MS in women than there are in men, right? Like all autoimmune diseases. I'm just giving that as an arbitrary example. What can we do for someone who has a history of exposure, and it's not hard to find that in women, unfortunately, because of cosmetic use. We want to find out how much of a role the environmental toxins are playing, and then decide how much detoxification, or if detoxification should play a part in their treatment. After taking a thorough history about their past exposures, in the correct situations, I will run array 11 on them.
Yes. So just hold on to that question.
Okay.
Let's finish this part that the lymphocytes that we're talking about, also they said they have receptors for hormones, right?
Yes.
Unfortunately, the same lymphocytes have also receptors for toxic chemicals.
Yeah. So they're ramped up also.
And so let's not to forget that. That's why altogether females are more prone to autoimmunity.
Okay.
Now, regarding MS, you touched this point that I read this article, which was published by 2 great scientists, which I met at the International Congress of Autoimmunity, Lerner and Matthias. The rise of autoimmunity is associated with the use of food additives and other toxic chemicals.
Yes.
Interestingly, that they looked at many parts of the world. When they looked at the most prevalent autoimmune disease, number 1 was the brain autoimmunity, the nervous system autoimmunity, which MS is one of them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And after that was the GI and the liver and the others. So it seems that toxic chemicals not only changing the gut microbiome, toxic chemicals get into the blood, toxic chemicals plus toxins of the bacteria opening the blood-brain barriers.
Yes.
When get into the nervous system, directly or indirectly, through cytokines indirectly or directly, can damage the neurons, and the results of that is neuroautoimmunity such as multiple sclerosis.
Yeah.
And so what choice we have in here? I believe number 1, always we are going back to, there is a say, they say everything ends in Rome.
Yes.
Okay. in human body, we go back to the gut.
Sure.
You have to take care of the gut, number one, because chemicals changing the gut bacteria. Okay, but if we go one step back further, first you have to teach your patient not to use any more toxic chemicals.
Yeah.
So let's go back to step number one.
In one of the previous episodes, we talked a lot about, the big purpose here is education.
Right.
So the more we know about what we are exposed to, the more conscious we can be about the decisions to, let's say, for example, drink water out of a glass bottle, avoid microwaving food in plastic, avoid anything, aluminum. There are many conscious decisions you can make to reduce your exposure to environmental toxins, right? But this is the whole point of it.
And don't put, I'm saying it in very general,
okay,
especially females, don't put any foreign material in your body. That including Botox injections, because Botox is a bacterial toxin. You may not like this, but if you are prone to autoimmune disease, you have to remove some of these environmental toxins from your environment. That is step number one.
Right. And then, in certain cases, depending on different arrays that we might run, we may talk about, enhancing the body's detoxification systems. But really, nothing is as powerful as reducing your exposure by being conscious about the decisions that you make. And that is free.
Absolutely.
That's a treatment that costs nothing other than time and attention, which is really a beautiful thing about it.
The next, you try to remove whatever is in your body, meaning the body burden of toxic chemicals.
Yes.
It's not an easy task.
Yeah.
Sometimes, I used to say that, imagine how many years took you to accumulate all those chemicals in your body.
Yeah.
20 years, 30 years, 40 years.
Yeah.
It may take 5 or 10 years also to remove those.
Yes.
And unfortunately, one of the best, the only choice, I'm saying that unfortunately, is just, IV glutathione.
Yeah.
I don't think they're walking, exercise, and others are free.
They are.
You can do all of those.
Maybe going into a sauna every once in a while. But yeah, the major treatments are free.
Right. And then remove all the offending foods from your environment.
Right.
And then finally, take care of the immune system.
Yeah.
Regulate the immune system of the patient.
Absolutely. And that's something that we really know so much more about today than we did even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yes.
And there are a lot of products available, which can help support a healthy immune system in the right direction.
Right.
Thank you so much. This has been, as always, a tremendous education for me and, I'm sure for everyone watching. To recap everything that we talked about today in episode 3, we really went over the different stages of autoimmunity. Stage 1, antibodies present in the system but not attacking tissue. Stage 2, increased antibodies also being targeted against tissues in the body. And stage 3, in stage 2 we have early symptoms, early vague symptoms. Stage 3, continued antibody response, really more significant symptoms and sometimes irreversible tissue damage secondary to that antibody attack against the tissues. And we also covered, the 3 categories of triggers, okay? On top of genetic predisposition, these 3 categories of triggers. The one we talked about really at length today was chemicals, environmental toxins. The other 2 are foods, and number 3 are infectious pathogens. In our next episode, episode 4, we're going to discuss this really large and very important topic about food as a trigger for autoimmune disease. It's going to be fascinating. I hope you check us out next month and tune in for that because it's going to be a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. We'll see you guys next month. Thank you.